Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Deep Daves. Today is special because we're going beyond our usual Deep Daves, and today we are entering Daveception. If you're new to this channel, hi. I'm Savvy. My name often autocorrects to Dave because the D is next to the S on the keyboard. And on my channel, I host a series called Deep Daves, where we dive deep into the lives of guys named Dave. We look at different influential Daves in our world, we read their books, and we talk about their pros and their cons. So far, we've covered Dave Ramsey, Dave Hollis, and Dave Grohl. But today's Dave goes even deeper than that. Today's subject is Dave Rubin, who himself is not only named Dave, but he is also married to another Dave. The layers of Dave just keep getting deeper and deeper the farther down we go. Welcome to Dave's All the Way Down.
Dave!
From the standpoint of, ooh, you will not go unpunished.
You guys asked for it.
Hey, what's up, my fellow small business supporters, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, welcome for the first time. If this is your first time here, please don't forget to click the subscribe button if you're interested in seeing more videos from me all about books and business. And if you've been enjoying my videos, please don't forget to ring the notification bell. I know that that's something we can easily forget, but I do have videos coming out every Friday morning at 11 a.m. Central Time, noon Eastern, so you won't want to miss those. And while you're at it, please don't forget to subscribe to my second channel, Your Morning Guru. If you're interested in Dave Rubin after I've covered him in today's video, we just did an entire week on the Your Morning Guru morning show channel talking all about Dave Rubin, looking at his show and things like that. As I just mentioned, this past week on Your Morning Guru, we followed Dave Rubin. We analyzed his career as a former comedian and his transition into political commentary. Side note, up with the failed comedian to political commentator pipeline. If anyone has any information about that, please drop it in the comments below because I keep noticing it happen. To follow Dave Rubin, we read Don't Burn This Book, his new book published through Sentinel, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. We also watched his show, The Rubin Report, and talked about what it is that makes Dave, well, Dave. In today's video, we will be diving deep into Dave's new book and dissecting it and reviewing it in full. But first, let's have a little bit of background on Dave Rubin. I first encountered Dave Rubin back in 2017 when he had one of my professors as a guest on his show. That guest was Laura Kipnis, a film studies professor from my alma mater, Northwestern University. And this was shortly after I had taken about 3 of her classes and had really liked her as a teacher. When I was a senior, she wrote this paper that said a lot of really inflammatory things, many of which I disagreed with, and then as a result, she faced a lot of criticism from both her students and from the public at large. 2 years after that, she went on to Dave's show to discuss her ideas and the process of being canceled. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of her paper in this video for the sole reason that there is a lot to unpack there. We started unpacking it a little bit on Your Morning Guru this past week, and plus this video is going to be long enough on its own just covering Dave's book itself. I don't feel right about criticizing Professor Kipnis or her paper without devoting the right amount of time to really do those topics justice. So if you're interested in a future video on that paper, please let me know in the comments below and we can make that happen. But back in 2015, when she had first written this controversial paper, a lot of online discourse was first beginning about what it meant to be canceled versus what it meant to be criticized. The discussion was beginning surrounding the line between bullying and criticism and what it meant to attack someone's work and ideas versus attacking them as a person. As a new college graduate who was just beginning to examine my own beliefs and my own views of the world, I was really interested in this particular line of discussion. Soon I became a casual viewer of Dave's channel. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I was a hardcore fan or anything like that, but I did appreciate the way that he engaged with a variety of different ideas on his show. I'm also pretty open about the fact that in the past I was your stereotypical libertarian frat boy. I was that kid in college who was like, but bro, capitalism bought us this weed. And as a result, then I thought guys like Dave were super smart. But much like the weed sold in those frat houses, the high of Dave's intellect did not last long. While Dave always interviewed a lot of interesting people, something about his discussions always felt a little bit surface level. Almost as if Dave didn't know what he himself believed, and the times that he was strong in his convictions, he didn't always seem to know why. And I think that confusion is what overall defines why Dave Rubin's book is so disappointing. The premise of Don't Burn This Book is that Dave left the left, or divested from the progressive side of the American political aisle after realizing that many Democrats didn't seem to protect free speech and tolerance as much as, from his view, as much as they used to. In this book, Dave attempts to explain why he became a classical liberal or a socially progressive capitalist, and why befriending conservative-leaning influencers like Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens helped him change his mind. While I think this topic could be really interesting if executed well, Dave's surface-level research and conflicting points leave much to be desired. As we start our dive into this book, let's begin with Part 1, The Frame. Dave's good friend Ben Shapiro once famously said,
"Facts don't care about your feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings.
Facts don't care about your feelings." Throughout this book, Dave shares this sentiment, calling for journalists, politicians, and commentators to focus more on the facts of an issue rather than the emotions that it evokes. On pages 18 through 19, Dave introduces this concept when he says, instead of having a solid argument based on fact, they simply moralize their way through life. Shouting people down and throwing loaded terms around is a distraction. Their over-the-top emotion is enough to convince unthinking people on a base level. They've won because it appears as if they're morally right. As a result, throughout this video, if Dave's facts do a good job of telling a complete story, I will commend him for it. If his facts leave out crucial information, I'll bring up additional facts to add to this conversation. And if his stories appeal to emotion rather than to facts, I will call him out on that as well. The second frame for this review is a thesis that Dave asserts on page 153. When discussing mainstream media's reaction to the Covington Catholic school conflicts of 2019, he says, "As I watched this all unfold, I knew there had to be more to the story. So while the Twitter mob assembled, I waited for more information." Here, Dave establishes himself as someone who waits for the full story before making a decision. Based on Dave's writing, I believe that he's genuine in that desire. However, there are also many places throughout the book where Dave's facts don't tell a complete story. We will find those places in this book as well and supply additional information. For our third and final review frame, let's discuss why Dave chose to leave the left. On page 114, Dave starts chapter 6, entitled Never Surrender to the Mob. Throughout this chapter, he talks about his desire to leave behind leftist commentary in favor of taking a more free market and capitalist approach, only to receive tons of hate from his left-leaning former co-workers. From this, Dave concludes that American progressives are a mob that engage in groupthink. I do think this can definitely be true at times, and I never support anyone harassing or bullying Dave under any circumstances. However, when this happens to Dave, the conclusion that he draws isn't that he has some mean and intolerant friends. It was that he, as a classical liberal, is a free thinker, while his neoliberal and socialist friends are part of a mob. If this assertion is true, throughout the book we'll need to see proof that not only does Dave have facts to back up his statements, but also that his opponents do not have similarly qualified facts to back up theirs. Like Jen Sincero's misrepresentation of depression in You Are a Badass, Dave misrepresents what being a progressive or a leftist is. His assumption is that you will move to the right once you have the facts, like he did. But that ignores that many leftists are basing their beliefs on facts too. And as we delve into this review today, we're going to go into some of those facts as well. Now, I want to make something very clear about myself. I actually don't believe that the political binary of left and right is useful at all. I wouldn't call myself a conservative or a liberal or a capitalist or a socialist or anything really. I actually think this is a case where labels do a lot more harm than good. I'm definitely not an expert on politics. I'm a book reviewer here to review this book, but in the interest of stating my political beliefs outright, I never have been a fan of the two-party system. What Dave says he wants to do in this book, which is to take in viewpoints from a variety of perspectives and change his views accordingly, is exactly what I'm all about. On Your Morning Guru, that's actually our main goal in the mission of our channel, to be anti-echo chamber. That's why we follow business gurus, health gurus, socialist influencers, conservative influencers. We follow everyone we can because we want to learn where a variety of different ideas come from. So I read Dave's book from the perspective of someone who agrees with this notion on the surface. I agree with some of Dave's stances in this book and disagree with others. And I'll dive into each of those similarities and differences as we move forward in this video. But I want to make it very clear that I did not enter this book as a reader who has any political party loyalty whatsoever. Shout out to Illinois for having open primaries because I don't want to have to tie myself to any of you motherfuckers. Like Dave, I'm also someone who looks at issues both individually and in context and then draws conclusions based on the information available and stays open to changing those conclusions should new and convincing information present itself. It's just that with the same information available, many of my conclusions are very different from Dave's conclusions. With these frames established, let's ask another question that's important whenever we discuss a book. Who is the target audience? Based on a book's subject matter, complexity of information, and the way that it talks to its audience, we can often glean who the author assumes is reading it. Toward the beginning of the book, Dave lays out some learning objectives for his audience. In his first chapter, he defines his book as a 10-step guide to teach his audience how to do a few different things. On page 9, he states, "At times, it'll seem like your entire life is about to become undone, but the secret of the mob is that it's always looking for new prey. It's a little dog with a loud bark, and eventually, if you don't give it what it wants, in this case your apology or surrender, it'll quickly get bored and move on to its next target." Now, first, because I promised I'd call this out, this is an appeal to fear, which is an emotion. Let's remember what Dave said on page 19 about appeals to emotion. Instead of having a solid argument based on fact, they simply moralize their way through life, shouting people down and throwing loaded terms around as a distraction. Based on Dave's standards alone, in this section of the book, he does not have a solid argument. Second, as we learn from context throughout the book, the mob he's referring to is the American political left. Most current leftists don't see themselves as a mob. However, many conservatives do see their left-leaning counterparts as part of a mob, similar to how many leftists see their conservative counterparts as part of a mob. Because Dave is casually referring to the left as a mob, using this bit of in-group language, it would appear that Dave's audience for this book would be center to right-leaning Americans. However, on that same page, Dave says that this book will help you stop hating America, the West, and straight white men. On page 145, Dave states clearly that it's the progressives and left-leaning Americans who are the ones who hate straight white men. He makes no references to any conservative or moderate Americans hating this demographic. He sees hatred of straight white men, America, and the West as a primarily left-leaning phenomenon. This would imply that if he wants his book to help people stop hating this group, that would imply that they do hate this group in the first place, meaning by Dave's logic, his readers are probably current leftists. So, is the target audience for this book conservatives tired of feeling victimized by a scary leftist mob, or are they current leftists weighed down by their hatred of men like Ben Shapiro? Dave addresses both of these groups on page 9 without any indication that these separate statements might be targeted at different audiences. So is the purpose of this book to help right-wing Americans navigate the trauma of being bullied on Twitter by Hassan Piker, or is it to show left-wing Americans where they went wrong? Now, it is entirely possible that this book is aiming to do both of these things, and that Dave's audience is all Americans regardless of current political leaning. But even in this case, because Dave does not indicate that these different statements are targeted at different groups, the assumption would be that both of these statements in that case would be targeted at both of those groups. And that doesn't necessarily make sense either, because, first of all, if he's hoping that leftists will read this book and see his point, why would he immediately accuse them of being a mob instead of trying to understand where they're coming from? Why would he assume that they have no facts of their own, just as he does? Second, if this book is targeted at current conservative American patriots, why would he assume that they need to stop hating America, the West, or straight white men? Many conservatives who pride themselves on American loyalty would be offended by this assertion. From all of this, I have concluded that Dave's target audience is people who already like him. Throughout the book, He doesn't make much of an effort to reach a new audience who could be coming at this without much knowledge of him or his current stances, instead choosing to double down on his own beliefs. On the surface, Dave's beliefs may not seem that bad. After all, he clearly loves facts and research instead of assumptions and the trust me bro nature of cable news stations. So where did Dave go wrong? Well, actually, before we discuss that, let's discuss where Dave went right. I ended up giving this book 2 stars instead of 1 star. Not every idea in it is bad. Actually, some of the points are really important and really beneficial. Page 172 is one of my favorite places about this. Dave says, "Stop being an expert on everything." On this page, he discusses the importance to being able to admit when you don't know something and to remain open and curious to new ideas. I couldn't agree more. On page 164, Dave says, "Here's another tip. Don't let yourself exist in an echo chamber. Seeing the wider scope of headlines from across the spectrum will help you view information in a broader context, diluting the risk of forming any single bias." Couldn't agree more. And I think this quote alone conveys a really important message about how we should seek out and process new information. Genuinely, Dave, I love that. On page 71, Dave actually puts this idea into practice. He invites readers who have different views from him to discuss it with him directly. He says, "Gather the facts and email them to me. Start a conversation with someone from a different ideological background." Again, Dave, I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, in the book review community, it's considered very bad form to ever send an author a negative review of their book, and since this review is going to be largely critical, I'd probably feel bad about emailing him this review, but I probably will reach out to him at some point. I think he should have me and RK on his show, since the principles of Your Morning Guru, namely being anti-echo chamber, seem to be on par with Dave's, and honestly, I appreciate the shit out of that. Dave, by any chance you're watching this, you have a standing invitation to come on my show, Your Morning Guru. We'll get high as fuck together. Emails in my description below. It's going to be a good time. Now that we've discussed where I found value in this book, let's delve into the content and discuss some of the places it went right and the many places that it went wrong. Part 3. Dave's ideology of facts first. In order to discuss this section, we first must decide, what is a fact? In my video exposing the New York Times bestseller list, I asked a big question. What is a book? Many people told me that before I'd asked this and broken it down the way that I had, they'd thought that identifying a book was obvious. You know a book when you see it, right? A book is something with pages? Well, what about audiobooks or ebooks? So is a book something with words? Well then, what about a bound sketchbook of blank pages? The truth is, what a fact is, much like what a book is largely contextual. So let's start with a basic definition. According to Merriam-Webster, a fact is something that has actual existence, an actual occurrence, a piece of information presented as having objective reality, which is exactly what most of us probably saw a fact as in the first place. But now let's ask the question that Dave's friend, Ben Shapiro, probably stays up late at night wondering. Was everyone else's wife really getting aroused during sex this whole time? No, sorry. The question that Ben is asking is, do facts care about our feelings? Well, as facts aren't sentient, no, they don't literally care about our feelings. In a purely literal sense, Ben Shapiro is right. Facts don't care about our feelings the same way that cheese doesn't care about our feelings, the same way that doorknobs don't care about our feelings, the same way that forks don't care about facts. But while facts do attempt to present an objective reality, the reality of human interaction, facts are always contextual. So here's an objective fact. 2 + 2 = 4. A very basic fact, and there's nothing you can do to dispute it. If I was teaching your child math and I told them 2 + 2 = 4, I would be presenting them with a fact. And the context for that fact would be that I want your kid to learn how math works. If I pass someone on the street at night and they're currently dying of a stab wound, bleeding out all over the sidewalk and begging me to call an ambulance, and I walk up to them and say, 2 + 2 = 4 and walk away, is that still a fact? Yeah, of course, the situation doesn't make the fact that 2 + 2 = 4 false in any way, but why would I ever say it in that context? The only potential conclusion you could draw from that situation is that I'm deciding not to help someone who's dying. Am I wrong that 2 + 2 = 4? No, I'm right, but in that particular situation, that fact doesn't matter at all. While a fact may be universally true, a fact alone does not tell a story. Much of the complete story lies in why someone is stating that fact in the first place. This is why I get really annoyed when any one group or ideology or side of an issue says, well, our side's the one that cares about the facts. Yeah, congratulations, you're very smart. And your opponents say the exact same thing about their side. Let's give an example of Dave presenting a fact. On page 100, Dave says, nearly half of all black men who died in 2015 in age group 15 to 24 died from homicide. In comparison, white men in the same age group died from homicide at a rate of approximately 8%. Now, let's assume that Dave's statement is factually true. What is it saying? Well, to know that, we must look at the context. Why did Dave tell us this fact? If Dave had told us this fact in a paper called "Let's Examine the Different Causes of Death in Different Races, Explore Why These Causes Happen in Different Demographics from Different Reasons, and then use that to find some solutions," then Dave would be telling us this fact as a way to inform us about the root cause of a very serious issue, homicide, and attempt to find solutions. But that's not Dave's context. This fact comes right after a section where Dave explains that police brutality isn't as big of a problem as most people make it out to be. He uses this fact as a way to show that more black men are dying from civilian murders than from police murders. The section as a whole starts with the topic sentence, "Great news for everyone except progressives. We are less racist than ever before." Contextually, this fact should be a point that Dave is using to prove that the world is less racist than it used to be. So how does a fact showing that proportionally more black men are murdered than white men show a less racist world? Contextually, Dave's argument is that it's not the police who are racist, it's just that black men are supposedly killing each other. Dave then never attempts to explore the root cause of this or come to any conclusions about that. So the question is, in this case, is Dave's fact racist? Well, no, as we've discussed, a fact is not sentient. His fact is just a sentence containing information. The context is what shows the overall point and therefore opinion and stance Dave is giving us with that fact. In both of the potential contexts I gave, Dave could have chosen to use this fact in a helpful way or in a racist way, and Dave chose the latter. This doesn't make the fact itself any less true, but it does make Dave's argument a little... We'll return shortly to the ways that Dave uses facts about racial dynamics to draw some very interesting conclusions, but first, let's go through a bunch of the other examples that Dave gives us about facts. Dave on gender. On page 100, Dave starts about the war on women with the topic sentence, "Western women are not oppressed. There, I said it." That is the context for Dave's facts. The rest of the section should theoretically be facts that prove this lack of oppression. The first fact that Dave gives a little further down the page is, American women have never been more liberated in our country's 244-year history. Is this true? Do women have more rights today than they did 244 years ago? Absolutely. Good job, Dave. You read the tiny little women section at the end of your 6th grade social studies textbook, gold star, Dave. But does this show that women are not oppressed today? No, actually, these two statements are completely unrelated. You could also say women in 1700 were more liberated than women in 500 BC. Does that mean that women in 1700 were treated equally to men? No, you're just comparing time periods, which is all Dave does on page 100. But let's continue throughout this section. On page 101, Dave says, data from the National Center for Education Statistics showed that women made up more than 56% of college students nationwide in 2018. Is this a fact? Yeah, but does this fact really say anything about whether Western women are oppressed or not? I don't think this fact really says anything either way. On the surface, it may seem that the fact is saying that women couldn't be oppressed because more women than men are in college. However, let's look at a couple different angles to this fact. First, 56% is just over half. It's not a massive disparity in the first place. That statistic could easily shift in a few years without any major changes. But let's say, for the sake of the argument, that this is significant, since at the end of the day, Dave's right, 56% is more than half, indicating a majority of women in colleges. We need to ask why this is happening. If this fact is meant to say the fact that more women are in college than men is significant, then the next question would be, why are more women in college than men? My first thought was, well, if men aren't in college, where are they? So I looked up whether more men than women were going into trade school, and I learned that, yes, one cause of there being a greater female to male population in universities is that more men than women are choosing to go into trade school programs. So then I once again asked, well, why are fewer women going into technical or vocational training? Often, a plumber, an electrician, or a welder can make a really decent salary without having as much debt as a college graduate. According to The Atlantic, women and girls make up about a third of students in so-called non-traditional vocational programs, those in which 3/4 or more of the workforce is male. This article also states that 94% of welding certificates went to men and 95% of cosmetology certificates went to women, which suggests a segregation in different career fields. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Labor reported that women make up about 11.6% of apprenticeship programs, indicating a vast majority of men in those programs. Why aren't women choosing many of these careers? Well, I decided to find some more facts to discuss potential causes. In January of 2021, USA Today reported that while construction is 97% male, one potential cause of this disparity could be harassment. 40 tradeswomen were interviewed in this article, recalling mistreatment including groping, sexual harassment, regular verbal harassment, and losing their jobs when they spoke up. Now, I will be the first to admit that is a really small sample size. Can I conclude that harassment and things like that are the reason that many women aren't going into trades or physical labor? No, I can't conclude that. Why aren't women going into these careers? I have no fucking idea. I'm just exploring some potential causes, and I'd encourage others in the comments to do so as well. I think these issues go a lot deeper than Dave is willing to dive, but on this show, we dive deep into the depths of Dave. Now let's head to page 84. Dave starts off this section with the standard, "I can't be prejudiced against X group, one of my friends is X." Except he takes it to a different level. On page 84, he says, "Recognizing the biological differences exist between the genders does not, however, make you misogynistic. I'm living proof of this. I love my mother, who's a woman. I also love my sister, who's another woman." Did Dave really just make the argument, I can't be sexist, I have a mom? Does he think that all the sexist men throughout history who did things like keeping women from being able to vote, does he think that those men didn't love their moms? Does he think that domestic abusers don't love their moms? Dave, what kind of argument is I'm not sexist, I love my mom? In this section trying to debunk sexism, Dave goes on to talk about one of the most controversial statistics of all time, the wage gap. On page 104, Dave says, "The claim that women earn 79 cents for every man's dollar is pure spin. The figure is an aggregate one, which compares the median of all women's earnings with the equivalent for all men, but this ignores job type, experience, and hours worked. When these factors are considered, the so-called gap disappears faster than conservative content on Twitter." And you know what? I'll be the first one to admit, Dave is 100% correct about this. I actually get really mad at people who try to use the wage gap statistic and then act like that's the end of the conversation. Saying women earn 75% of what men earn is not proof of sexism in itself. But much like, and a lot like your mom last night, this fact goes both ways. Dave's next sentence, "When these factors are considered, the so-called wage gap disappears." That's also a fact. Like we've done for every issue so far, let's put this fact into context. If the conclusion is that the median income for all women is 79% of the median income for all men, but that gap disappears when job type, experience, and hours worked are considered, the question shouldn't be, why are employers choosing to pay women less for the exact same work? That question would be useless, as it's not true. The question should instead be, why are women working fewer hours and taking lower paying jobs compared to their male counterparts? So let's discuss some potential reasons. The Atlantic article I referenced earlier suggests some possible causes, including women fearing harassment if they go into male-dominated fields, plus cultural factors, including parents not teaching their daughters these skills when young, putting them at an earlier disadvantage to be good at these types of skills. But I'll be the first to admit, I don't have a survey or hard statistics showing how many women these factors affect, so I'm not going to say with certainty that this is the cause. One cause that Dave brings up also on page 104 says, "The U.S. Department of Labor released a paper that examined more than 50 peer-reviewed studies and concluded that the wage gap could almost entirely be explained by choices made by men and women, including what they studied in college. In 2018, research conducted by Georgetown University economist Anthony Carnevale showed that women took majors that led to lower paying jobs, early childhood education, communication disorders, sciences and services, and nursing, whereas men chose higher paying subjects such as computer science and math. Are these facts true? Yeah, I would assume so. I doubt Dave would lie about US Department of Labor statistics, so Dave is right. But what does his fact mean in context? Does this fact prove that sexism doesn't exist? No. All this fact proves is that women and men often go into different career fields. So I'll ask again. Why? Is it biological? Is there evidence that some type of increase in estrogen makes women desire lower paying fields? I mean, I can't find any that says that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Could sexism be a factor here? Could harassment in male-dominated fields possibly discourage women from continuing? Maybe. And then I'll ask another question. Why do careers like nursing and early childhood education pay a lower median income than computer science and math-related careers? In the case of early education specifically, the low payment can't be solely determined by the free market, as much of early education happens in public schools which are funded by the state. So this is all to say, I don't have the definite answer to these questions, but Dave doesn't have it either. I don't think anyone has all the answers to this. That's why these topics are still being studied and debated to this day. On page 104, Dave gives us another fact. He says, according to data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, unmarried, childless females under age 30 who live in cities earn 8% more than their male peers in 147 of 150 U.S. cities. What this data, or what Dave's selection of which data specifically to include, doesn't tell us is whether this study was comparing unmarried, childless women to unmarried, childless men, or whether it was comparing unmarried, childless women to all men. And this isn't to say I can't go read the study myself. I'm saying that Dave, as the author of this book, left more questions than answers in this section, which is a failure on the part of his writing, and as a reviewer of his book, I found that this section didn't convey enough clear and direct information to cause the reader to learn something. The second question I'd ask, of course, is why. Earlier on this page, Dave suggests that pregnancy could be a factor in women making lower median salaries. And I absolutely agree. I think this is a massive factor. Dave says women frequently choose to start families and raise children. Research by the University of Michigan and University of California show that 40% of women leave STEM fields after starting a family. Just 23% of men do. So again, I'd ask, why? Men choose to start families too. Dave, who's in the process of becoming a father himself, should know this. So why are a higher percentage of women leaving their entire career field behind when having children? Is it that women have some inherent quality bestowed upon them by God that makes them want to be with their children more than men do? It's possible, but if so, I have yet to see proof. Might there also be other factors at play? Could a reason that many women leave careers after pregnancy have to do with the free market itself? Many employers become worried when their female employees get pregnant because time off of work or maternity leave could require that employer has to spend extra money and extra resources training a temporary employee to take that woman's place, or that they might lose out on some of the income or productivity from that woman's contributions when she's gone. As a result, some employers may hold off on hiring pregnant employees or promoting them to higher paying positions. This is very, very illegal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Actually, according to a Bloomberg Law article from early 2021, pregnancy discrimination filings in federal court continued to rise in 2020, and the number of federal pregnancy discrimination lawsuits has been rising steadily over the last 5 years, with claims in 2020 up around 67% from 2016. The article then goes on to explain, pregnant workers have always been vulnerable to workplace discrimination, but they are especially vulnerable during an economic downturn. The expense of parental leave and the prospect of increased healthcare costs can make pregnant workers attractive targets for furloughs, layoffs, or forced leave. The article continues, workers face an equally challenging road after giving birth, then going on to cite Bureau of Labor statistics, indicating that during COVID-19, women have lost jobs at a significantly higher rate than men. Now, if I'm going to go into all of the potential causes of why COVID affected this, as well as all of the other reasons that mothers might face discrimination in promotions or other factors driving them out rather than what fathers would face, we will be here all day, since as you've probably been able to determine, there is way more than just one cause. My point is not that I know for certain what every potential cause for this might be. My point is that for Dave to make a blanket statement like, Western women aren't oppressed, and then claim, like he does on page 105, that disparity doesn't always mean discrimination, sometimes they are the reward for life choices, which is fair, without analyzing the systemic factors that influence those life choices, then his research, in my opinion, isn't thorough enough for this book to be informative. I'd also like to point out another piece of Dave's quote that we just referenced, which will transition us into our next section. In the picture I presented earlier about pregnancy, you probably saw that Dave used the following sentence when he was talking about women. They're the only gender that can get pregnant. Please don't cancel me. Well, good news for you, Dave. I actually think cancel culture is a horrible drain on society. Like you, I believe in open dialogue rather than shutting people out. So Dave, if you'll stick around, I'm going to discuss your misinformation on transgender issues. Dave on LGBTQ issues. Dave is a gay man. As I mentioned, he's married to another Dave. During his discussion about rights for specifically gay people, he does a good job. On page 37, he says, "Take it from a dude who happens to be married to another dude. The whole gay marriage thing is a no-brainer from a classical liberal perspective. If you believe in individual rights, meaning that every citizen of a country should expect the same legal privileges and protections, whether or not you agree with their choices, then great stuff, you're on the right path." So Dave is good at defending the rights of gay people like himself. Specifically gay people, specifically like himself. In section 5 of this video, we're going to discuss why some of Dave's views on gay rights aren't necessarily always consistent with all his other views. Dave mentions on page 185 that he has both gay friends and straight friends. He doesn't reference any bisexual or asexual friends. According to a 2021 Gallup poll, bisexuality makes up 55% of the LGBTQ demographic, while gay men and lesbians combined make up about 37%, the rest being presumably asexual people and heterosexual trans people. But facts are contextual, so what could I even be possibly saying with that fact? Where Dave's argument really starts to fall apart when regarding LGBT issues is when he starts to discuss trans issues. We'll start towards the beginning of the book on page 14, when Dave asserts that there are two genders. Now, this is not an uncommon thing to say at all. In fact, I think a lot of people believe that there are two genders. But let's talk about where that might or might not be true. Dave says the left's vision is a new social order that despises our hard-fought freedoms, eroding the First Amendment in favor of hate speech laws, promotes socialism through redistribution of wealth, and denies scientific fact in order to weaponize the power of feelings by asserting that there are more than two genders, for example. In Dave's notes section in the back of the book, he provides no sources to back up the assertion that there are scientifically two genders. And because Dave doesn't elaborate here or anywhere in the book on what he means by there are two genders, I'm going to assume that he's talking about the fact that sexual dimorphism in mammals, including humans, tends to categorize us into male and female categories. And if he were to say that that is true for the overwhelming majority of the population, he would be absolutely right. But he stated that two genders equals scientific fact, without any science to back it up. Because Dave is also using this argument about how the left is trying to deny science and infringe on our free speech, and he's trying to use this section as an antidote to the left's, quote, new social order, this argument overall, devoid of any fact, seems to be based entirely on fear and emotion, so I'll refer back to page 19, in which Dave suggests that emotionally driven arguments aren't as valid. Now, how many genders are there? Let's answer this once and for all. I don't know. What I do know is that sexual dimorphism isn't the be-all, end-all, not only of our social understanding of gender, but also of biological sex. According to the Intersex Society of North America, about 1 in 1,666 births results in a child without XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, and 1 in about 1,000 births results in XXY chromosomes, or a child who will likely contain both male and female sexual characteristics. And these are just a few of the intersex conditions out there. I'll link below the article where I found this, which also cites multiple other sources that lead to further reading on this topic. The research estimates that the total number of people whose bodies differ from standard male or standard female is about 1 in 100 births, or about 1% of total people. Yes, intersex conditions are absolutely in the extreme minority. However, statistically, so is being gay. According to that source I cited earlier when I was talking about how Dave probably has no bisexual friends, about 5% of Americans are part of the LGBT community at all, 37% of which are homosexual, meaning a gay man or a lesbian. That would make about 1.85% of the population exclusively homosexual, which Dave is. So in this case, Dave, as a gay man, is only about twice as likely to exist as a child born with an intersex condition. As it turns out, even when you're talking only about 1 or 2% of people, considering about 350 million people exist in the US, those are still significant numbers of people that deserve recognition. Now, as you've probably noticed, I haven't even touched on transgender issues yet, just intersex issues, which Dave didn't even technically bring up. It was really hard to discuss Dave's assertion that it's a scientific fact that there are only 2 genders, as he never discussed what the science behind that says or what the characteristics of those 2 genders were. Were those 2 genders he's referring to meaning penis and XY chromosomes equals man and vagina and XX chromosomes equals woman? Or were those 2 genders just man and woman in general with allowances for trans people? But either way, my point is that if scientific proof points to there being more than 2 biological sexes, it would also make sense that there would be more than 2 genders as well, especially since for cisgender people, which make up about 99% of the total population, sex and gender are often linked. But don't fear! Dave does bring other people in his book many times. He first discusses trans people explicitly on page 59, where he starts his section entitled Trans Issues with the sentence, "When I was a boy, I wanted to be a Decepticon named Soundwave." Honestly, the most offensive thing about that sentence is that Dave calls himself a comedian and then for a joke, paraphrases and recycles the attack helicopter joke, which has been overdone to death by everybody. Have some respect for originality in your comedy, Dave.
By show of hands, how many of you have televisions? Pretty good, okay. And how many of you have the here net? All gay people. Is everyone here gay? You're gay. Do we have some lesbians? I sense lesbians in the crowd. And straight people, I should ask about this. Do you have any gays in relationships, or as I like to call them, gays from the future?
Dave does then continue to say that he supports trans people's right to change their body, and he supports an adult's right to do whatever they want to their own body. And I've got to say, he's right about that. Every adult should be allowed to do whatever they want to their own body. And while this seems obvious to me, I recognize that this sentiment could be a big deal for some of Dave's more hardcore conservative followers, who may not support an adult's right to do whatever they want to their own body. So I will thank Dave for making that point explicitly. However, as the section continues, Dave's use of misinformation about the transgender demographic becomes a big problem. On page 60, Dave says, "We're now allowing record numbers of children to change their gender through invasive surgery and potent puberty blockers." The problem with this sentence isn't that Dave wants to protect the children. The problem is that he's putting invasive surgery and puberty blockers on the same level when these 2 things aren't remotely similar. I'm not sure if in this case Dave might be confusing puberty blockers with hormone replacement therapy, but once again, those things are not equivalent. So let's talk about that difference. Hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, is when a trans person takes hormones like estrogen or testosterone, often through injections, pills, or gel, to help them develop their desired sex characteristics. For example, testosterone will help a transgender guy grow facial hair and gain a deeper voice, while estrogen will help a transgender woman grow breasts and gain a more feminine shape. HRT involves replacing hormones and giving yourself new ones. This is important, guys. This is not a puberty blocker, and this is not what a puberty blocker does. Let's talk about what a puberty blocker is. According to the Mayo Clinic, puberty blockers are technically a medication called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GRNH, and here's what they do. In those identified as male at birth, GnRH analogs decrease the growth of facial and body hair, prevent voice deepening, and limit the growth of genitalia. In those identified as female at birth, treatment limits or stops breast development and stops menstruation. So while a transgender guy assigned female at birth might take a puberty blocker to prevent growing breasts or ovulating, this is not at all the same as taking a testosterone injection, which would additionally deepen their voice, make them grow facial hair, etc. The reason that puberty blockers are often considered much safer for young children rather than hormone replacement therapy is that puberty blockers are not permanent. Many cisgender adults, Dave included, worry that a child who comes out as transgender might change their mind at a later date, as children's frontal lobes are not fully developed enough to make long-term life-changing decisions. On page 59, Dave says it's why we don't allow kids to get tattoos, buy a firearm, and drink alcohol or smoke until they're grown up. And I'll also add joining the military in there. But the point is, Dave's concern is that a child's mind isn't developed enough to make choices that permanently alter their body. So how could it be responsible for a parent or a doctor to allow a child to permanently alter their body? Well, the answer is that puberty itself permanently alters your body, while puberty blockers do not. A trans woman assigned male at birth may have a much more difficult time transitioning later in life if her voice has already deepened and she's already developed sexually mature male genitalia, facial hair, and other masculine qualities. Testosterone is a hell of a drug. If a 12-year-old child who's assigned male at birth announces that they're actually meant to be a girl, a parent putting them on puberty blockers can help them as an adult finish their transition to womanhood with medically prescribed estrogen and surgeries like vaginoplasty or breast implants. However, let's say that 12-year-old child grows up to be an adult who says, you know what, I think I was wrong, I'm a man after all. Well, then you take them off of the puberty blockers, and then they'll just finish male puberty, as was always going to happen without them. According to the Mayo Clinic, use of GnRH analog doesn't cause permanent changes in an adolescent's body. Instead, it pauses puberty, providing time to determine if a child's gender identity is long-lasting. It also gives children and their families time to think about or plan for the psychological, medical, developmental, social, and legal issues ahead. If an adolescent child stops taking GnRH analogs, puberty will start or resume. The article also lays out the many benefits to why puberty blockers are beneficial to trans children, including improving mental well-being, reducing depression and anxiety, improving social interactions with other kids, eliminating the needs for future surgeries, and reducing thoughts or actions related to self-harm. And guys, improving a trans child's mental health is crucial. According to a 2015 study from UCLA School of Law, the Williams Institute, about 81.7% of transgender people have reported suicidal ideation, while 40.4% reported having attempted suicide at some point in their lifetimes. The suicide rate for trans people is notably higher than for most other demographics, which implies to me that a non-permanent solution like puberty blockers, which can markedly improve a child's mental health, should be a serious consideration, not treated as something dangerous and permanent and scary the way Dave makes them out to be. Also, puberty blockers are usually prescribed by the child's doctor. I'm not sure why Dave thinks he knows more than the doctor does about medicine in this situation. My favorite thing about this book, if you'll remember back in my prose section earlier, was that Dave said it's okay and admirable to admit when you don't know something and to remain curious instead of having to always be an expert. I think he'd do well to apply that here as well. On page 84, Dave also says, that said, I can also respect the transgender community without wanting my language and pronoun usage to be dictated by the state. Well, there's some good news for you, Dave. Literally nobody has tried to have the state control pronoun usage. No law can be created that determines how people have to speak. We have this obscure little amendment in our Constitution. It's a little hipster one, you might have never heard of it, but it actually prevents a law from ever being created that could infringe on our free speech. You know, trans people value free speech just like you do, Dave. But because Dave doesn't bring up in his writing specifically what he means by state-controlled pronoun usage, but he does spend like an entire chapter at the end of the book discussing how his greatest mentorship relationship of all time is with Canadian psychology professor Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson famously opposed Canada's C-16 bill on the basis of state-controlled pronoun usage. I can only assume that C-16 is what Dave is referring to here, since he's not giving me really anything else to go on. So I guess let's take a moment and talk about C-16. First of all, C-16 was a bill introduced in Canada, and it was never introduced in the US. However, if that means Dave's getting himself involved in foreign affairs, good for you, Dave. But second of all, C-16 does not call for state action against people who use the wrong pronouns. That's literally a myth. I'll link CBC's breakdown of Bill C-16 below, but basically here's what C-16 actually did for trans people. It added gender identity as a protected class from discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act, so that means that trans rights are now protected alongside the other already protected classes of age, race, sex, religion, and disability. It also added gender identity as a protected class against hate speech. Now, hate speech could be what Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin thought was referring to state-controlled pronoun usage. However, the bill defines hate speech not as using the wrong pronoun, but as, quote, advocating genocide and the public incitement of hatred. Basically, Canada already had laws stating that you could not advocate for violence against other people on the basis of sex, religion, race, etc., and then it added gender identity to that group of protected classes. The third piece of C-16 is that it added that crimes motivated by discrimination against trans people would be classified as hate crimes alongside crimes motivated by prejudice against other protected groups, sex, race, etc. Basically, C-16 just added trans rights as a protected class among already existing protected classes. The bill never referenced pronoun usage at all. Brenda Kosman, law professor at the University of Toronto, which is the same school that Jordan Peterson teaches at, stated that, I quote, misusing pronouns alone would not constitute a criminal act. In conclusion, state-mandated pronoun usage was never on the table in the first place. Nobody's asking for that, Dave.
You guys asked for it.
No, nobody asked for it. I'd also quickly like to point out, this is a side note, I'd like to point out that I find it a little hypocritical that Dave's mentor, Jordan Peterson, so strongly opposed C-16 adding gender identity as a protected class on the basis of free speech, which this bill didn't even violate, yet he's totally silent on his own country's province of Quebec having literal language police dictate where French versus English must be used. Maybe he's spoken on this and I just haven't seen it, but I can't find it. If anyone has sources showing Jordan Peterson discussing Quebec's violations of free speech, please drop it below. Otherwise, your move, JP. Now let's move to the section containing the facts that I introduced at the beginning. Let's talk about Dave's use of facts and what they convey about his views on racism. Dave on race. In this section, I'm going to be intercutting some interviews I did with others who are also invested in issues of racism and police brutality. First, with my friend and colleague Sarah, who also read Dave's book along with me and had a lot of opinions on it from her perspective as a Black woman in an interracial marriage.
We are here today with Sarah, who I really appreciate you wanting to have this discussion on Don't Burn This Book. Sarah is a regular viewer and chat participant on our show, Your Morning Guru, and we've been reading this book this week to discuss Dave Rubin, and I'm really glad you wanted to discuss this book with me, so thank you, Sarah.
No, you're welcome. I'm excited. It definitely, as I was listening to it, sparks a lot of conversation that I've had a lot recently and that still make me scratch my head, and I'm all for open dialogue and hopefully gaining understanding out of this mess of a book. My husband's white. We have tons of friends with kids. We're the only biracial couple. And now that I have a daughter, the first things I think about when I think about school are, oh, she's in a rural area. His family is well known. How will she be received? While my white counterparts that doesn't even cross their mind. And that's the privilege of it. It's not that they have a privilege because they're white and I'm not. It's literally just the things that as a majority member in this country, you don't have to think of. And I think he focuses so much on the shock value of privilege and how it ignites people, and then tries to tie those facts in like, oh, now you're angry because you didn't have a handout. You worked at the general store for 50 cents a day.
Right.
You don't have privilege. And it's like, that's not what that means. I think that's why this chapter is so ineffective and also damaging.
So to start off, can you tell me a little bit about the graduate work that you're doing and what your field of study is that made you reach out to do this discussion on Dave Rubin's thoughts on systemic racism?
Yeah, so I'm getting a master's in criminal justice, and I'm currently a graduate research assistant. What I do within my research is I look at marginalized groups. Namely, I look at kind of the intersectional groups. So looking at age, LGBT individuals, and so on, and looking how society treats them, especially in regards to the criminal justice system.
To start Dave's section on racism, on page 97, he explains that the world is less racist than ever before in history. And then on page 98, goes on to detail the ways that people have become less racist over time. Like a good boy, Dave includes facts and cites his sources. Gold star, Dave! Only here's the thing. Literally everyone already knows that the world's becoming less racist over time. What most people are saying is that while racial issues have improved over time, they still exist and racism still destroys lives, so let's continue to take action to make the world better. Because fixing these issues has never happened in a vacuum. But Dave's attitude for the rest of this section seems almost defeatist, like, well, we've already solved racism as much as possible, so let's just pack it up for the day.
He starts off this chapter talking about his interview with Larry Elder.
I'm interviewing Larry Elder, and I'm still on the left, and Larry is he describes himself as a small L libertarian, but in essence a conservative, and I start talking to him about systemic racism, and I'm sure many of you have seen the clip, but he just beat me senseless with facts. And I kept saying, well, systemic racism has to exist because there's racism and there's a system, and those are two words, and I put them next to each other, and there's gotta be something there, and he just beat me senseless, and I truly believe this. My best and worst career moment were at the exact same time. I don't know how many people can say that, but it was obviously my worst career moment because I went into a fight, an intellectual battle, not ready, not armed properly to argue with the guy who is a fact machine.
And he talks about, how Larry Elder is, he was someone who helped Dave change his views because he presented him with new information when he was a guest on his show. And I mean, I can respect that a lot, that someone is given new information and is willing to change their views. But even the new information he's given seems to be still pretty surface level. So I'm wondering, like, what information did you have before that this changed it? If like, right. So, but he starts off being like, so he calls Larry Elder, he says, because Larry Elder was a black man who's the son of a janitor from a working class home, and now he's a radio host, right? And he was like, he calls him living proof that race and class don't hold people back, which is kind of wild that Dave throughout this book talks about the importance of looking at facts and looking at, the whole picture, but then we'll call individual people living proof of something. It's like, well, just because you know one person that did that doesn't mean that that's the trend on the whole. So how do you know that? Like that part kind of threw me off too.
That's a common thing that happens though, especially with all of the conversations that have been happening since everything with George Floyd and the protests. Yeah. A lot of people, if they see something, they're like, oh, well, prime example, you mentioned Candace Owens this morning on the podcast. A lot of people will be like, oh, but you can't say that there's systematic racism and that these factors affected them because look at these people, they turned out fine. I've even seen that in my life, like, oh, well, you're very vocal about these issues, but you seem to have it really good. I'm like, but it's a core problem. And if we're not addressing core problems, then yes, you do have these success stories and that's amazing, taking nothing away from them on either side of that. But having a greater understanding of how the system is failing people and how it was originally started, it makes that success story even much greater, but also that much more sad that there's so many things that are embedded, stacked against people that people aren't even aware of. So when they see these things being called out and the only knowledge they have is, oh, you must be saying that because these people are Black, because they are minorities, they didn't get this job, they didn't go to this school. That's not the argument. The argument is there's so many things that happen to establish these systems that now, even though they're not affected directly by race, they started that way. So the system itself has started a certain way. It's going to continue functioning a certain way if there's no problem addressed about it.
So he starts off where he talks about, he's in this interview with Larry Elder, and Larry asks him, what's an example of systemic racism that you see? And Dave says, you could find evidence that in general cops are more willing to shoot if the perpetrator is Black. And Larry responds by saying, where's your data? Where's your basis for saying that? 965 people were shot by cops in 2015. Only 4% of them were white cops shooting unarmed Black people. And my first thought was that a lot of these sentences, I mean, I don't know Larry Elder, so I'm not going to judge him as a person, but a lot of the sentences he's saying here seem unrelated to each other.
They are, but this is a very common argument that is
Yeah.
made when this comes up. What
Yeah.
about the black on black crime? What about this? Also, I want to preface to anybody watching, I am no expert on any of this. This is just as a black reader reading this book, giving a perspective. But to speak to those statistics, when you're asking about something that is systematic racism, pulling up current statistics is not what people are talking about. Now, both sides of the fence will say these statistics are bad and want to argue about how to necessarily fix them. But it really goes back to things like, why are there these high crime areas? For example, Savvy and I were chatting a little bit earlier. A lot of people don't know that when blacks were free, they were like, hey, go live your lives. That doesn't mean that it was like, oh, okay, let me buy a house. Let me find a job. A lot of it was, okay, just because we can't legally own you does not mean that we want you to thrive. So when the housing market started picking up and there's developers, there were actual contractual statements that said, to white families, if you buy or sell this home, you cannot buy or sell to a black family or a black person. So over the years, as that's happening and the majority is building more wealth through real estate, and you have these families who can't even get into the market, then you have these disenfranchised people that are starting from nothing to move into these things. Those are more examples of how it's a systematic race issue. Now, when people are buying homes, is someone not selling to you because you're black? More than likely not, unless they're just an outright racist, which exists. More than likely, there's going to be things like systematically, you didn't have the socioeconomic education to be prepped to buy a house. You may not have the wherewithal of how to get started with things like that, not because the opportunity isn't there, but because you may be in an environment where it's not even presented to you. You look at the United States, if the majority of people in the United States are white, the majority of deaths in the United States are going to be white. That's
Right.
it's a non-factor. Like, numbers wise, there's no possible way for that to even out. But that doesn't, just because one thing is true does not eliminate the fact that preconceived notions and biases, whether aware or not, are affecting these situations and how they're looked at.
There were, well, first of all, it doesn't even say that there were more white people who got shot by police. That doesn't even say that.
No.
It says 4% were white cops shooting unarmed blacks. It doesn't say how many black people who were shot were armed. It doesn't say how many white people who were shot were armed. It just says that that's the percentage of, so apparently 96% of the people who were shot by cops in 2015 were not unarmed black people. So they could be armed black people, they could be armed white people, they could be unarmed white people, they could be people of any racial background. The facts really don't tell that much. It just says, here's one specific group of people. And that isn't also taking into account, the fact that white people outnumber black people in the US 5-1.
Right. And the argument I like to make too is that, especially when people were talking about the protests and things like that, I mean, there's a whole other discussion between the organization Black Lives Matter and the sentiment. That's a whole nother thing. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at things holistically, there's a lot of noise over here. There's a lot of talk. People are outraged, and you want to be like, oh, but what about these white? I mean, y'all should be upset about that too. If that upsets you, cool. Police brutality, we're not just we want it to stop for black people. It's for all people. So if it's happening across the board, that's actually a common ground. Police reform and defund the police isn't oh, we just don't want cops anymore. It's no, it shouldn't take longer for me to become a hairdresser than it does for me to become a cop in the United States. That's crazy.
Elder thinks that the biggest burden that young black men face is growing up without a father. But nowhere does Dave in this section explore any reasons why that might happen. So I don't understand why, so he's saying, first of all, I didn't understand if Dave was saying that he says you need to grow up in a household with a mother and a father, which seems a little strange because Dave is a gay man who's he's having a child through surrogacy.
Right.
So he's going to have a household without a mother and a father, which is totally fine. That's wonderful. So you could have a household with two mothers, you could have a household with two fathers, but let's say for the sake of the argument that what Dave meant here was a household with two parents is going to probably be more successful for the child than a household with one parent, which, okay, that could be true. So if that's true, then if Larry Elder says that the biggest burden that Black people face is being raised without fathers, why does that happen? Like, why?
I would argue that that isn't the biggest issue. It is an issue. It's something that is happening. And again, that can be, people wonder why, oh, well, people just want to stay in the ghetto or stay in the projects. Well, if that's the only socioeconomic stance they've had and there's not been a break in that and they can't get their footing, essentially these people are invited to a game of Monopoly that they weren't allowed to earn money on until like the other sides had 400 turns. Okay, now here you need to come in.
Right.
Try to garner this wealth. So there's, of course, the economic issues and poverty, things like that. And yes, it is a major issue and that's something that is very much advocated for but a lot of that is because there's so much Black men have to face in this country. I mean, my dad was in the home for my brothers, and that doesn't make some of the obstacles that they will face any less.
Yeah.
Your family structure doesn't change the issues that, one time they were pulled over, genuinely going to get donuts. No joke. They were on the way to get donuts.
Oh my God.
Pulled them over. And my brother instantly, when he was like, where are you headed? His first thought was, I'm not telling him where I'm going because he will think that I'm being a smartass.
Because it's like the cops get donuts stereotype? Yes. Is that why? Oh, God damn it.
Yeah. So it's just those little things where like most people, like, you wouldn't have even thought of that. But in that moment, he was like, no cop interaction. I'm not even going to. And it's more.
Yeah.
Just because he has a dad in his life doesn't mean that those things aren't some things he has to think about. While it's a major, major problem, just my personal opinion, would not think that's the biggest plight. I think it's more, again, a symptom we need to look at and be like, what is happening, not just with this individual man? Because if you're like, oh, why did this man leave? Honestly, some people just leave because they suck. Like, that happens as well.
And the thing is, if there is this disparity, Dave talks later in the book when he's talking about how women are not oppressed. He talks about, well, men are much more likely than women to go to jail for the same crime. And I'm like, okay, so if men are more likely than women to go to jail for the same crime, then might a reason that Black men or even white men or just men in general not be as present because more men are going to jail than women, so more women are keeping the kids. So wouldn't that be a reason? So wouldn't that be kind of an argument? He doesn't explore it at all, though.
But what's crazy is that that's what happens so often when we have these conversations. They bring up the stat they heard or just this one-sided argument, and to people that don't know history or don't look more into it or have just thought this way, like, oh, yeah, this makes sense. The media shows me that most Black people are thugs and they're living in the ghetto and no one has a dad, and that's great. And if you see that, it reinforces that. So it's almost like he just surrounds himself with people that reinforce that. And then it's just being given out to other people who are reinforcing it. So they're in an echo chamber. That doesn't mean that it's true.
I think he's missing a lot of different components. So Black people are 5 times more likely than white people to be incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
They are more likely to be convicted for the same crime and serve longer sentences than white people.
And as I read Dave's entire section on race, I had to wonder, what's the point of this? While many of the statistics Dave shares could theoretically be used to find root causes of greater homicide rates among Black Americans and address those systemic issues, instead, Dave's writing seems to indicate that these stats are supposed to somehow convince us that racism isn't really that big of a deal and we don't need to do anything? So all of that was section 3 of this video, where I talked about Dave's use of facts. What was the point of that section? Was it to prove that I know more facts than Dave? No, of course not. Maybe he knows more facts than me. Who knows? Who knows the net number of facts each of us knows? Was it to show that Dave is objectively wrong in his assertions? No. As I admitted, a lot of his facts were true. My point was to show that a lot of facts exist in the world. Some facts tell different stories or lead to different conclusions depending on the context we use them in. And that Dave, the writer of this book, left out a lot of information that can both support and negate some of the conclusions that he draws from his facts. Moreover, it's important to show that Dave, who claims he moved away from the left-wing sector of American politics because facts changed his mind, may be neglecting that left-wing Americans also have facts as the basis for their opinions. And it makes me wonder why Dave didn't know these facts back when he was a progressive. Did Dave just stumble into being a progressive by default without thinking about it and then assume that's what everyone else did too? I wouldn't be surprised if this were the case, considering that I'm not the only reviewer of this book who's done a ton of additional research on Dave and on the stats that he brings up. So let's move to part 4. Goodreads reviewers did more research than Dave. The Goodreads reviews for this book were fascinating, especially since so many of the reviews countered Dave's claims with facts of their own, often debunking many of his claims. I'm not going to be revealing the names of these reviewers as I read excerpts of these reviews from Goodreads, as I don't want to put anyone out there publicly who may not be a public figure. However, if you are watching this and you recognize one of these reviews as your Goodreads review and you want a shout out, and just please let me know and I'll amend this, I'll edit your name into the description and all that. And many of these reviews will be referencing absolutely wild things that happened in this book that I haven't even unpacked yet in previous sections. And that's because I was saving it for now. Didn't want to be repetitive. Here we go! First review. Dave's extremely well-funded ideas are not the transgressive thoughts of a free-thinking skeptic, and they especially aren't worth burning. I do not recommend Don't Burn this book to Dave's fans, haters, or skeptics for the reasons I will explore in detail below. The reason I wouldn't even recommend this to Dave's fans is that this book will not help you fight off liberal and leftist arguments, because none of the arguments go deeper than the absolute surface level logic needed to justify conservative intuitions. The purpose of this book is to coddle you, to convince you that your intuitions, including the bigoted ones, are just as valid as someone else's informed opinion. This leads Dave to some uncomfortable and cringeworthy positions. We're going to talk about Ben Shapiro in a second, so we'll just skip over that. And to sloppy arguments that do nothing to engage with what liberals and leftists actually think. For all his talk of facts, Dave didn't bother to do any research for his book. His arguments are littered with inaccuracies, contradictions, and surface-level thinking. For example, here are the 2 most egregious arguments from the book. Guns. In his section on guns, the second most slapdash in the whole book, Dave is correct in exactly one time. Gun violence cannot be solved exclusively by laws, though he doesn't even try to argue why we shouldn't introduce more laws. He assumes that because prohibition won't work, we shouldn't bother trying. He doesn't extend this logic to drugs, by the way, arguing elsewhere that heroin and crack are too dangerous to be legal. Overall, Dave acknowledges that it should be difficult to get a hold of guns, but believes our gun control is sufficient. He accuses progressives of chasing utopia with their gun policies, which makes me wonder if he knows that other countries exist and that a lot of them have lower gun violence rates than the United States. His one invocation of facts is also he uses the tired right wing of Chicago, which has strict gun control policies and yet a high rate of gun violence. I will say, Dave shits on Chicago so much in this book. Dave, have you ever been to Chicago? I live in Chicago. It's not as bad as you're making it out to be, dude. Like, we have our fair share of problems, but like, so do you, bud. He points to this correlation and says, see, doesn't work, without bothering to investigate why that might be. A reasonable person will note that Chicago is invoked by right-wingers because it's a majority city and thus full of liberals and gun control, surrounded by areas with lax gun laws, making it easy to bring guns in. In an even slimier move, Dave, like every conservative, miscites the statistic. He says that only 11% of firearms are used in crimes that are obtained from gun retailers. He probably got this number from Source and Use of Firearms Involved in Crime Survey of Prison Inmates 2016, a study by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. If he had any integrity or read the source himself, he would have explained that while 90% of gun crimes are committed by people who didn't acquire the guns legally, only 43% of those guns were bought off the black market. 25% of them can be traced back to legal purchases from American gun shops before trading hands. It took me 2 minutes to find this source, by the way. Dave Rubin spent years in politics, writing a book about politics, and still doesn't know how to read a chart or cite more than one example to establish a trend. Let's check out another review. If you've been out of the loop with regards to the culture war, honestly, this is a pretty good place to start. All your favorites are here, from IDW all-stars like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson to lesser-known peddlers of discontent like James Damore and the Covington Catholic Schoolboys. Each character, story, and idea receives a perfunctory analysis decorated with a few platitudes. The left has the real racist. racist. Facts don't care about your feelings. The woke mob is coming for anyone that disagrees with their orthodoxy, and sent on its way. Despite the last chapter consisting of a reminder to the reader to stay away from the fire and brimstone of eternal social media outrage and performative politics, most of this book reads like a series of tweets and hot takes. I was able to skim through the book in maybe a couple of hours. Some weighty topics like climate change and the unique privileges and problems faced by Asian Americans today barely receive a page as Dave rushes to get the book over with and cash out. In Don't Burn This Book, Dave Rubin barely has any time to focus on any of the topics that constitute the classical liberal canon. He begins with a few words about the persecution he faces as a free-thinking firebrand who quotes throughout the book most guests on his show, The Rubin Report, who in turn often misquote or manipulate statistics. He describes his struggle to find himself first as a gay man, then as a merchant of grievance, and finally as a born-again adherent of a vaguely sketched semi-traditional religious doctrine and soon to be father. The journey seems to cause Rubin physical pain as he describes his hair falling out due to the stress of political backlash for his swerve to the right. But he never doubts his path. After all, he is firmly committed against doing the bare minimum of research to push back on any of his often conservative guest claims and is therefore forced to accept some truly odious views no matter the evidence against it. It feels useless to point out the sloppy argumentation here, because even Rubin doesn't seem too committed to any of it. For example, he cites the Fryer study that says black people are 23% less likely to be shot by police than white men, missing, of course, the fact that this statement is about people who are stopped by police in the first place, of whom the vast majority are black, depending on where you are in America. That Fryer himself has pointed this out on numerous occasions will not slow down a man who is already strongly under the influence of the red pill. At another point in this book, Rubin laments that the top 1% pay 90% in tax revenue, which is clearly unfair, without mentioning that if his preferred 18% flat tax rate were instituted and modified to include both income and assets, the wealthy would probably still pay a disproportionate amount of taxes solely due to the fact that they possess a disproportionate amount of wealth, about 70%. Elsewhere, it is claimed that the major threat to polar bears is hunters, not dehabitation due to climate change, which of course is more of an indictment of poaching and hunting practices than it is proof against the dangers of warming in the Arctic, which is definitely occurring, an incontrovertible fact that does not appear in Rubin's one-page treatment of climate change. I was just really happy to see all these Goodreads reviews really delving into the meat of these topics. It made me really excited to see that. Hello everybody, Editing Savvy here. As I am going through this video, I am realizing how much I didn't cover. And if you could see how long this video already is, okay, this book review video script was 32 pages long. I typed 32 pages. It was 11,000 words long. That's like half of a novella, okay? So this video is already so long, and there is so much in this book that I haven't even started unpacking yet. So I'm wondering, do you guys want a part 2 to this video? Let me know in the comments below if you'd like a part 2 that delves even deeper into some of the other sections in this book where Dave is further hypocritical. Like, there's just so much more. Plus the fact that, like, Dave Grohl's book just came out and it's in transit to me right now, and Dave Hollis has a new book coming out at the end of the month. So if I have this video and then I do a second part to it and then I do those 2 reviews, this could just be a full Dave month. Do you guys want October to just be Dave-tober? Do we want Dave-tober? I don't know. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like a part 2 to this video. And then there's the whole self-help section at the end of his book where he's like, Jordan Peterson told me I should have a child, so now I'm gonna have a child. Like, it's so fucking wild. I haven't even gotten into that. Okay, do you guys want a part 2? Let me know below. Thank you. As you've probably seen from everything I've reviewed so far and from the Goodreads reviews that I've read, a common theme in Dave's book is that he wants freedom above all else. Freedom from government regulation, freedom to speak his mind, freedom to live his life as he sees fit. However, in the next section, we'll discuss how Dave's love of freedom doesn't always extend to everyone. Part 5. Dave's hypocrisy surrounding freedom. On pages 1 and 2, Dave lays out his love for the free market very clearly. He says that the left alienates sensible grown-ups who dislike high taxes, oppose open borders, enjoy the free market, and harbor a healthy distrust of socialism. They're equally unwelcoming of sane, decent people who happen to be fiscally conservative, classically liberal, libertarian, all of which are political leanings that describe favoring of a capitalist system with limited government regulation. On page 38, Dave shows how much he loves the free market. He says, I wouldn't take legal action against a Christian baker if the baker politely refused to create my rainbow-themed wedding cake. Unfortunately, we witnessed in the legal case against Melissa and Aaron Klein, the now infamous wedding cake bakers, progressives had decided that if you don't run your business the way they want you to, they will take legal action against you. Dave's argument here is that in a free society, a gay couple like him and his husband would have every right to get married, but a bakery would also have the right not to fulfill their cake order, citing that they personally do not support same-sex couples. Now, on the surface, that argument seems to be pretty consistent with Dave's other stated beliefs about the free market. In a purely perfect capitalist utopia world, competition should take care of this, right? If enough people shopped for their cakes elsewhere, the tolerant businesses would be the one to survive. But the hypocrisy comes in when Dave doesn't apply this principle to every business he analyzes. Just a little earlier in this book, on pages 25 and 26, Dave discusses the infamous case of Google firing employee James Damore. Dave says, in a now famous memo titled Google's Ideological Echo Chamber, How Bias Clouds Are Thinking About Diversity and Inclusion, Damore counter-argued that the genders are biologically different and, as a result, often gravitate toward different careers. After then filling us in with some information about what a great model employee Damore was to Google, Dave tells us that Google fired Damore for this in 2017. Regarding Damore's firing, Dave says, in other words, free speech is good, unless you say something bad. Here, Dave is equating free speech, which is a legal phenomenon, with someone being fired, which, according to Dave's own free market beliefs, should not be intertwined at all. If Dave believes that a bakery should be legally allowed to refuse service to a gay couple because it's a free market, why wouldn't he also believe that Google, another private company, would have the right to fire James Damore as a private company that can do whatever they want? Why does this issue suddenly cause him to bring up free speech, which was never legally violated? Oh, and for the record, just so you guys know, I don't think that James Damore should have been fired in this situation either. But I don't think that big companies like Google, who rely on selling individuals' data for profit, are beacons of feminist ethics anyway. Likely they were doing this for optics. But I can recognize that a private company like Google had the right to fire Damore. So why does Dave have a problem with that after spending most of the book simping for the free market? Dave then says this of Damore. When Damore appeared on the Rubin report a few weeks later, he was the most reserved, unassuming, timid guest I'd ever had. I personally had to spend 30 minutes in the green room trying to get him to relax before we began recording. Dave, why are you telling us this? The intention of this paragraph seems to be to appeal to our emotions, to evoke sympathy for Damore as he's simply a victim of this whole debacle. And maybe he is. But Dave's description relies entirely on emotions meant to invoke the moral high ground, which, again on page 19, he told us makes for a weak argument. Alright guys, you ready? It's time! Here's what we're gonna do! We're gonna give credit where credit is due. The left also sucks too. That's why we give credit where credit is due. On page 28, Dave says that the mainstream center-left has become like an R-rated movie stripped down to PG for minimum offense. He also brings up examples of celebrities engaging in performative activism, attempting to fight for left-wing causes with little more than lip service while sitting in their mansions or on their yachts. And yeah, he's right about this. I really hate how political activism has become an aesthetic to some people, particularly corporations like Google in this case, whom I firmly believe fired Damore for optics rather than for any real tangible harm caused to. One of my favorite YouTube channels, Red Letter Media, calls this being passive progressive, which, as a grammar nerd and a cynic about corporations, I fucking love it.
Just make Poe and Finn gay. Make them super gay. Why the fuck not? That's how they come across in this movie. Just do it. They're so phony.
Is this a new term, passive progressive? It's like a play on passive aggressive? Because remember, what's it, Josh Gad's like minor character?
Beauty and the Beast, yeah. He's a supporting character. He's gay. You see him dancing with a guy in one shot. Look how progressive we are.
We wouldn't do it with the main character.
When a company appears progressive for profit, but in reality does nothing at all. And a lot of regular people do this too. Simply putting up a black square on Instagram or going to a march in a pink kitty cat ears hat and then doing nothing else to speak out against injustices afterward, that's passive progressive. It's like Dave says, an R-rated movie stripped down to PG. He's right that many mainstream US liberals have this problem, but what he fails to realize is that the conservative side of the aisle doesn't have the solution either. Or if they do, he hasn't proven it to me in this book. Okay, done giving credit where it's due, back to Dave's bullshit. On page 53, Dave says, progressives are slowly taking it upon themselves to police our language on the state's behalf. The authoritarian approach has already created a chilling effect on good people, who now self-censor in order to avoid being fired from their jobs, dumped by their partners, or ejected from college. Dave, this is not the state at work. Progressive civilians cannot police language on the state's behalf. They do not have that jurisdiction. All they can do is make you feel bad about it, and maybe fire you from your job, which again, is the free market at work. You said you agreed with that earlier. What is your solution to this other than the government making political affiliation a protected class, which would mean more regulations, which you explicitly said you were against? If the free market allows a bakery to refuse baking a custom cake for a gay couple, the free market also allows a company to fire someone for spreading any ideas on company time, whether conservative, liberal, or otherwise. On the previous page 52, Dave says, we're protected by the First Amendment, which is probably the greatest man-made law of all time. But heed this warning. It might not always stay this way. Dave then provides no proof whatsoever anywhere in this book of anyone trying to repeal the First Amendment ever. Nor does he ever give examples of people trying to pass laws that violate the First Amendment. In other words, he shows no facts to back up his claim that the First Amendment may always protect us. So what was the purpose of heed this warning? It might not always stay this way. The purpose is fear. Once again, this is an argument based on emotion, not fact. And Dave is the one that explicitly stated that we should prioritize facts above feelings, meaning that, in the absence of fact, this point should be disregarded. Now, finally, let's talk about page 39. Page 39 was where I learned the most in all of this book. I learned something important on page 39. Let's see what page 39 says. Look at my friendship with Ben Shapiro. He's an Orthodox Jew who doesn't personally agree with gay marriage because of his devout faith. In fact, he flat out describes my lifestyle as a sin. Surprise, surprise, I disagree with him on this view. But this isn't a problem for me because A, we accept that our different opinions are of equal worth, and B, he's not trying to overturn the law to infringe on my life. Ben Shapiro also stated that he won't come to Dave's anniversary party because of this.
It's an anniversary party. We're just having a party, and I'll even throw in some kosher food for you to make sure you don't have to bring your own.
You know, honestly, I'd have to think about it. I'd have to think about it.
I think I may have moved you on coming to an anniversary party. What do you think about that?
I think it would be unlikely that you'd move me.
We're friends, but he has a religious belief around gay marriage, and he wouldn't bake me a gay wedding cake, and that's okay, and I don't want Ben's kosher cake, okay?
What I learned most from this book is that Ben Shapiro is a shitty friend. Nobody's gonna force you to marry a dude, Ben, but you can't just be supportive of your buddy. You can't just show Dave some love just because he's your friend. Damn, Ben's over here like, facts don't care about your feelings, and guess what? Neither do I, bitch. Like, that's Ben. Facts don't care about my feelings, and Ben doesn't care about his friends' feelings. How sad is that? Dave, you seriously need some better friends, bud. Seriously, email me, call me, whatever. DMs are open. We'll smoke weed and be gay together. That sounded sexual. I meant gay as in you like men, I like women, and also you're a Dave. Part 6, conclusion. Many times throughout Don't Burn This Book, Dave asserts that his purpose in writing this book is to get the reader to think, and to encourage the reader to challenge their preconceived notions. And to an extent, Dave's book accomplished that goal. I mean, just look at my sources in the description below and see how much additional research I did just to make sure I was talking about the topics in this video in the most informed way I could. Dave's book did cause me to think, even if it just pushed me to research further to fact check him. So in a way, Dave did accomplish his purpose, and I genuinely appreciate that. At the same time, Don't Burn This Book seems to be a confusing mishmash of logical fallacies and facts devoid of context. After reviewing this book, and after following Dave for a week on Your Morning Guru, my conclusion is this. Dave, you need some better friends than Ben Shapiro. RK and I will come smoke a joint with you in LA. We'll shoot the shit. We'll have a good time. Again, DM's always open. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode of Deep Daves. October is a very special Dave month as Dave Grohl, the best Dave, just released his first book, and Dave Hollis, not the best Dave, but not the worst Dave, that's Dave Ramsey. Dave Hollis will be releasing his second book in a few weeks, so you're getting 3 episodes of Deep Dave this month. If that's exciting for you, Don't forget to ring the notification bell. I will see you guys all on Monday. Please don't forget to support small businesses because that's the only way that Dave's vision of the free market is going to stay alive. I love you guys. Bye. Happy Friday.
Dave. From the standpoint of, ooh, you will not go unpunished.
You guys asked for it.